All right, you pushers, the final video on the colonial regions is this video we're making right now on the Middle Colonies. So the Middle Colonies are the colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. So I just want to give you kind of a some background on how these colonies were founded. So to start, we're going to be talking about New York. And New York began as something called the New Netherlands. And so in 1609, which is right around the time of Jamestown Colony, 1607. So in 1609, Henry Hudson, who he was sailing for the Dutch East India Company, and he sailed into a river that was named Hudson River for his name. And he claims the region that's going to become New York for the Dutch. And he establishes what they call the New Netherlands, or New Netherland. And the goal here, the Dutch were looking for a foothold into the fur trade. They were similar to the French in what they were looking for in the New World. It was Henry Hudson who bought the island of Manhattan from Native Americans. He did this, he paid them some beads and such to buy the island of Manhattan. And his when this colony is established, it was very strict. No religious tolerance, no free speech, really harsh governors. It was, as it says on the slide, a company town. So this will eventually become New York. So the story of how it goes from Dutch hands into the English is kind of fun. To give us an idea, one second. There we go. To give us an idea of the area we're looking at for Henry Hudson is right here in the bottom, 1609. This is the location of New York City today, right? Present day New York City. And you can see behind the arrow a little bit of Manhattan Island. So Henry Hudson landed here and established New Netherland. And then he also came into the Hudson Bay, which, named for Hudson, and explored along there. So what we end up with is this region here between these 2 points that is has a very heavy Dutch influence in the early 1600s. So if we're looking at New Amsterdam Harbor, this right here is the present location of New York City. So we have a primary source showing us what New Amsterdam Harbor looks like. We've kind of already gone over this. So one thing that we're looking at here, like we went over that it was a strict colony. When we're looking at religious dissent, they were persecuted, but there was some limited power to make laws or self-government in the Dutch colony. Okay, one second. Okay, this was the slide I thought I was coming up on previously. So when we're looking at New Amsterdam, and if you go out and find an aerial view of New York City, you will recognize this this landform, right? Because this is where the like skyline and downtown New York City is. But what the Dutch did with their colony, it was very aristocratic, is they separated the land out into estates that they called patroonships. And so these were like feudal estates where there would be one person that is the landholder and that is going to administer and have authority in the estate. And then they would promote it and settle it with 50 people on them. And this place became very cosmopolitan, meaning was a very diverse place with many different languages spoken. And that's still a feature of New York City today. So looking at a larger map here of this New Netherland, these are the patroonships. And if you look at a current map today, these are going to be like not exactly lining up, but they're going to approximate the counties. So this is similar to the feudal system, and this is sort of like Maryland, right? This is kind of what Calvert's view of Maryland was going to be when he gave large grants of land to his Catholic family members. Okay, also, right, we have New Netherland here. There was also an area of land that came to be known as New Sweden. And so this is where we were talking about New Netherland, New York City here and Manhattan Island. You come south to present day Philadelphia, and it's part of something called New Sweden. So, Sweden had some early colonies. And so, what we find here in these middle colonies is the initial European influence here is not English. So, when you look in places like Philadelphia, um, and New York, you can see the Dutch and Sweden influence in architecture and some of the food. And then there was also a large number of German immigrants who settle in this region as well. So um, in the mid 1600s, right? So we had New Sweden 1638. In the mid 1600s, we have New Sweden established. And in 1655, the Dutch, under the command of this man, Peter Stuyvesant, Stuyvesant, I'm not really sure how to say that. That's one of the hard things about teaching this class. I don't always know how to pronounce things in other languages. But he attacked New Sweden, right? So the Dutch attack New Sweden and they take over New Sweden, and you know the fort falls, and that is how the Swedes or Sweden leaves the new land, and New Sweden is absorbed into New Netherland. So it's still not owned by the English colonies. Um, in this comes a little bit later, right? Um, Over time, as the Dutch are living in New Netherland, there's also English immigration. And so over time, the number of English immigrants begins to overtake the number of Dutch immigrants. And so eventually we end up with half and more than half of the total population identifying as English rather than as Dutch. So um, Charles II, who this is after the restoration of his crown, Charles II granted the area of New Netherland to his brother, the Duke of York. And so they start calling it New York, even though the Dutch say, wait a minute, we still own this territory. The Duke of York sends an English squadron of ships into the harbor, and the leader of New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant, he has no defense. And so he surrenders, and the region is renamed New York, and the Dutch leave the New World. So it's kind of basically the English stole the colony of New Netherland and renamed it New York. So what the English did at this point is something with a large percentage of English population, but there's also a large percentage of other ethnicities and European backgrounds in this region. Um, Sorry, there's an angry Peter Stuyvesant, and that's how we come to get New York. Now, the next middle colony is Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is an important one to understand because it has a kind of important position in the colonies as a mediator or a middle colony, and a colony that's really accepting of a lot of different viewpoints. So Pennsylvania starts kind of as an experiment, right? So some people have nicknamed it Penn's Holy Experiment. So to give you some background, in the mid 1600s, there's a group of religious dissenters called the Quakers that arise in England, and they were called the Quakers because, as part of their worship and church activities, they would physically shake or quake as they feel what they call the Spirit of God. So they're called the Quakers, and they're hated in England because they will not pay taxes to the church. They won't take oaths. They won't serve in the military, and so we have this group that want to that need a place to live. So William Penn um, is given a grant of land. Let me get to the right screen here. William Penn is given a grant of land by the British Crown. Now, this is later in colonial history, 1681. And the reason that Penn is given this grant of land is because he is owed a large debt. His family's owed a large debt from the British Crown, and the Crown couldn't pay him back in money. So they paid him in land, which he called Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania becomes a proprietary colony. But what's different is that William Penn decides to live in Pennsylvania and actually administer and um, lead Pennsylvania from the colony. Most proprietors stayed in England and let others come to the colony. So he advertises all over Europe, and he sees a place for these Quakers in Pennsylvania. And he advertises all over Europe. He promises land and freedoms, and he promises that there will be a representative government, which means you'll have elected representatives in government, and he promises a charter of liberties. And so, if we break this down, this charter of liberties, charter means like written, legal, binding written words, and then liberties is freedom. So, this is like another word we could use here is a Bill of Rights, or a Bill of Freedoms. So he promises this Charter of Liberties, and he wants to see fair treatment of Native Americans. So this is why people call this Penn's Holy Experiment, right? So William Penn has this experiment in Pennsylvania. Um, as Pennsylvania develops, it's going to become more, it'll be like the first state that abolishes slavery, for example. Um, and it is an open and kind of accepting place for many people. Okay, so we have New York, we have Pennsylvania. Okay, we have New Jersey is another one of the Middle Colonies. New Jersey was gifted by King James to two friends, Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. This is actually, New Jersey used to be part of New York, but you can see here this was a section of New York that was located between the Hudson River and the Delaware Bay, and James thought it was just too big. For like New York itself was too big, so he split this off. And so we have these proprietors that allow for religious freedom, they allow for an assembly, and they give generous land to attract settlers into New Jersey. So that's our third colony. And then Delaware is created out of the area of Pennsylvania. So William Penn granted the lower three counties of Pennsylvania their own assembly. So what this meant was Delaware was its own colony, it had its own assembly, but Delaware shared a governor with Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. So they are closely linked. And so if we look at the Middle Colonies, you can see here this right here, New Jersey in yellow. This used to be part of New York, but was cut off and became its own colony. And then Delaware is those three lower counties of Pennsylvania that were, created or given their own assembly, even though they share a governor with Pennsylvania. So if we want to look at the characteristics of these middle colonies, they have good river systems. So the rivers are swift and they move pretty quickly, and they provide a transportation network. There's good valleys with fertile soil, so there will be farming here, but they're not plantations for cash crops. What was grown here were grains. So these colonies are called the breadbasket of the colonies. This is where grains and staple foods were grown. Very diverse population with a lot of influence from many European nations. So we have the Dutch in New York and New Jersey. We have New Sweden, used to be right here where Philadelphia is. You can see right next to Philadelphia is Germantown. So very diverse population. This region will become known for manufacturing, and in the colonial times, there's not a lot of manufacturing in the colonies, but this is where it would have been at the time. So there's iron mines, glass, shipyards, paper production, printing presses were very common here. In fact, one of the famous colonials, Benjamin Franklin, he is from Philadelphia, and he has one of the earliest printing presses in the colonies. Major cities in this region are New York and Philadelphia. So these are our middle colonies. So that wraps up our look at how each colony briefly was created. As we move on to the next topics, we're going to be looking at colonial society as a whole, the way the colonies interact with Native Americans, and labor systems in the colonies. So happy studying, A Push.